Joining us now on The Debate, Robin Sears, Senior Partner with Navigator Limited, Bob Anderson, Professor of Sociology and Political Science at the University of Toronto, Linda McQuaig, co-author of The Trouble with Billionaires, and Jonathan Kay, Comment Pages Editor at The National Post. And it's good to have you three here again, and Bob, you for the first time. Glad we could get you in here finally.
Thank you.
I want to start by just reading an email we got here to TVO, which kind of is the foundation that will start our discussion here. Here we go. It's important, the emailer says, to understand that this movement is unfolding internationally and is fluid city by city. You cannot paint it with the same brush. It cannot be pegged in a new ideology or ism. The occupation is not interested in specifics at this time. It only has three premises. Number one, the environment in crisis. Number two, social justice issues, the failure of government around addressing them. And number three, people are not happy. As hard as they try not to be, they are fearful about the future. The Occupy movement is shining a light on all of the above. The problem is that governments, corporations, and those with their heads in the sand find this light uncomfortable. Okay, Theodore, thank you for that email. Let's just start. Linda, is he onto it?
Oh, I think he's saying some very, very important things there. I guess I would say, in addition, that I think one of the really effective things about the Occupy movement is that it's zeroed in, it's identified the key problem as the fact that the top 1% have too much wealth and power, and that negatively impacts the bottom 99%. And that's a kind of very simple and powerful message that has implications for all those other areas he talks about, like the environment and general dissatisfaction, etc.
Simple but accurate?
Absolutely accurate.
Top 1% in Canada have too much power?
Yep, too much wealth and too much power.
Do you know how much you have to make to be part of the 1% in Canada?
Well, you have to make over $180,000 a year.
That's
Okay.
a long way from sort of the multimillionaires and billionaires that you wrote about.
Let's put it this way. If I were designing the movement, I would have targeted actually a higher group.
So the top tenth of a percent.
Actually the top 100th of 1%, those are the really rich and powerful individuals.
You agree with the foundation of my question?
I definitely agree with the thrust of what they're doing, and I think they've absolutely identified the problem. I mean, whether or not you go after the gazillionaires or just the sort of more normal rich, whatever the cutoff point is at which the top 1% begins, just remember that 99% of Canadians are below that.
Okay. John, do you feel you completely understand what the people in that park in downtown Toronto who were there for whatever it was, a month or two, want?
No, because I think the whole movement has become a kind of Rorschach test that people project whatever their political obsessions are on the movement, good or bad. You know, left-wingers I know will say, well, it's about X, Y, or Z, and conservatives I know will project typically bad motives to them, and say, oh, they're just lazy or they're communists or whatever. However, I do think we have to distinguish between the U.S. movement and the Canadian movement. The U.S. movement has been more focused. It is against banks, and in particular banks that have gotten massive bailouts for taking risks that in good times made the 1% very, very wealthy. In Canada, I think the movement's been more diffuse, and I think this shows a basic principle of protest, which is that protest, you need a good villain. In the United States, you have that villain in the form of investment banks and financiers who got bailed out by the government, get favorable tax treatment. Canada is a little different. Our banks did not fail us.
The villain is not so apparent up here.
Well, here, I mean, you still have income inequality. I still think it's an issue here. But you didn't have people whose faces you could put on placards and said, these people got bailed out with public money. And you didn't have the good villain figure, which I think is why the movement was a little less hard-edged here in Canada.
Robin, let me check the checklist with you. The environment, social justice issues, and fear of the future. Is that your understanding of what Occupy is all about?
No, I think I would come down more on Linda's side of this. I think it's fundamentally about a sense of unfairness and inequality in the way in which, not the 1% probably, but the middle class have fared in the last 20 years. You know, we have seen these flat income lines for people who are in that, however you want to define the middle class in a Canadian context. But, you know, to me, Steve, the more interesting thing as somebody who deals with persuasion and communications for a living is, why did it happen and why was it successful now and not in the fall of 2008? Why did it take 3 years for this to incubate after the crash? And I think one of the things that we will say looking back on this a few years from now is this really was a point at which the zeitgeist changed from being government is the problem to government needs to play a role. Taxes can always be cut to taxes are essential to do some things well we want to do. If you think of that period from 1945 to 75 as a golden era for social democracy and growth in governments, and then 75 to today almost as being the conservative backlash, maybe this is the beginning of another period.
Bob, do you have any thoughts about why it took 3 years for this thing to eventually percolate and boil over?
Well, I think it's the banks, the bank situation in the States. Inequality has always been there. It's been increasing for 20 years, 30 years. And where I think that you're wrong is that it's been happening from the top 50%. They've had growth in the last 20, 30 years.
Not just the top one.
Not just the top one.
The top 50?
Top 50% has seen growth in income. What's happened in that period,
Stand by, Linda.
it's the bottom has stagnated. There's been no growth, and they haven't lost much. But there's been growth from the 50th percentile up. The amount of growth rises as we get to the top, and it's the top 0.1% where we really have the problem. So what's happened then? Why is the middle class complaining? Well, it's because there's been a lot of switching around within the middle class, a lot of restructuring, a lot of people have lost jobs and have gone elsewhere. But in terms of average incomes, it hasn't changed.
I think that's a bit provocative, so I'm going over here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into a huge debate about the statistics, but I actually think they're quite clear. And that is that, in fact, almost all the income growth has gone to the top 10%, and particularly the top 1%. And in fact, in the middle range, what you have is stagnating incomes, certainly stagnating wage levels. So for instance, the median household income in Canada, adjusted for inflation, hasn't increased in the past 30 years. In fact, it's declined slightly from, I think it's 49,000 to 47,000.
Inflation included.
No, I'm just saying taking inflation out.
Take it out of the
like
mix.
in other words, if you throw inflation, it throws everything off. But so, in fact, the real income growth, the spectacular growth is at the top, and I think that's very important. And I don't know, just to pick up on Robin's point about why it didn't happen sooner, that is an interesting question, because it has been getting gradually worse and worse. I do think, I mean, you raised the point, why didn't it happen right after the crash in 2008? My guess is that Obama kind of stepped in and seemed like the answer. Like he, all the hopes and dreams, could we possibly change everything that's become so wrong under the Bush administration? Could that be? He said, yes, we can. And people believed it. Took a while to see that that wasn't going to change. Then the Tea Party came along and really skewed the debate far to the right, so that by last summer, all that was on the table was spending cuts.
So, Robin, now it's no, we can't, and now we know we can't?
No, I don't think so. I think that voters still have an expectation of their politicians and their governments that they bloody well better, or they'll keep throwing them out of office. We've seen quite an anti-incumbent mood, left and right, around the democratic world in the last year and a half.
Not here. Every incumbent government in this country's got reelected this year.
Canada's different for different reasons, but I mean, look at Western Europe. Every government almost has changed. We had the huge sweep of the U.S. midterms. But I think the message here is that people haven't given up. They're just demanding more of their political class. And the political class had better deliver or they will be thrown out.
John, the lack of a singular message, given the democratic nature of Occupy, do you think that's hurt in their efforts to hammer home the things about which we've talked at this table and that there is some consensus on?
Yeah, I think so, because income inequality, I think, is an important issue. It's not a sexy issue. It's a very, it's a gradual issue. It's become a problem gradually since the 70s. There hasn't been one acute crisis point for it. And it's a hard issue to rally protesters around. I mean, I think you've managed it a little bit with the Occupy movement. The big problem, I think, for protesters has been a failure to engage campuses. The problem with the visuals of the Occupy movement have been that it is dominated by the kind of people who have time to spend weeks and even months in public places without going to jobs or school. They tend to be professional activists or homeless people. And so the visuals of it, if you're a conservative journalist going to one of these places to confirm your stereotype that these are all people who maybe are not part of mainstream society, you will find it. What has typically happened with successful protest movements in North America, go back to the 60s and currently in places like Iran and other places where you have truly repressive governments, is students get involved. Because students are people who are intelligent, they're mainstream, they also have time on their hands because they don't have 9-to-5 jobs. And more importantly, in a place like Canada, they tend to be the children of the elite. So they then go home for the equivalent of Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever, and they talk to their parents who are members of the elite, and they engage with a more powerful generation of people. And so protest ideas have a chance to percolate through the student movement. That has not happened in the Occupy movement.
Well, we should ask a guy who's, you know, we got a professor here who hangs out with students all the time. How many of your students do you think have been engaged by this?
I know some are.
But not on campus. You haven't
no,
seen
not
you
on
haven't
campus.
seen campus protests. They've all been downtown.
Why do you figure that is, Bob?
Well, I think it's for the same kind of reasons that you just said. Nobody really knows what it's about. We see homeless people there, and it doesn't seem serious to me.
It doesn't seem
in lots of ways, the stuff that's portrayed in the media sometimes doesn't seem serious. You go down, you see a bunch of homeless people or a bunch of people in tents hanging out. Really, people who have serious jobs don't have time to do that.
Bob, let me just tell you, as somebody who tries to persuade and move public opinion for a living, if you have 100 cities around the world in one 2-month period with no external funding organization can draw people to live in tents in the rain for 2 months, that's serious.
Well,
that doesn't happen normally.
I'm not saying it's. I'm not saying it's not serious and that you're not getting people out there. What I'm saying is, a lot of people are saying that the wrong issues are. That the issues aren't really being talked about. When you interview somebody in the Occupy movement, is there a leader that says what it's about, or
There's
does
no
everybody?
leader.
That's right. That's my point. Everybody has a different version of what's going on, just like what you said.
But I think the theme of the top 1%, I mean, that's sort of the defining theme of the movement. That has come across. And without anybody printing up pamphlets or, you know, doing PowerPoints or anything, that message has come across, and that's been very powerful. And in a sense, it's like, you know, it's like, let's say the feminist movement or the racial, you know, anti-racism movement, you know, simple concepts, women's equality, racial equality, income equality. You know, these are simple concepts, and I think they've permeated to a certain extent.
I think it's difficult to make that comparison from a media perspective because if you're talking about racial equality, there were very simple demands that were made back in the civil rights era. Same thing is true of campaign against sexual discrimination. I think in terms of income inequality, it's much more complicated. To say, oh, it's 1% versus 99%, that's not a message, it's a brand.
It's more complicated.
Okay, but that makes a big difference if you have a protest movement because it's all about taxation and income redistribution. How do you capture complex concepts like that if you're holding the sign?
They've done it brilliantly. Like the concept of the top 1%, it has galvanized people. That has really attracted the attention, the idea that there's too much wealth and power.
I'm not sure it's
So
galvanized
what are you
people,
supposed to do, though? I mean, you're talking about the top 1%. How do you fix this?
The tax system would be a great place to begin.
Every protest movement, which is an attack on privilege, has exactly this characteristic at the front end and exactly your reaction. These people are homeless, hippie, and not serious and not focused. The March on Ottawa in the 20s had that reaction from establishment Canadians. Every protest movement gets hit with that at the front end.
that's not true.
What is clear here is a demand, is I think Linda's point. Inequality has reached a level that ordinary Canadians are offended by it. And they are offended especially by the contrast between Attawapiskat on the one hand and unbelievably indulgent displays of wealth and private consumption. And so, you know, you can argue that the statistics don't vindicate the anger and the symbolism.
That's not what I'm saying.
But in fact, people are genuinely angry about this incredible poverty and incredible affluence in a society that tended to pat itself on the back for being a little fairer for most of its existence.
Well, I should be clear about what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I was asked how people perceive the movement or why I think it's not moving. I think that there is far too much inequality. I should be clear about that. Far too much. But I was giving the facts that it's not in the middle that's the problem. You want to help people. If this is a movement about social justice, why aren't we looking to the bottom?
Oh, but that's a danger to just look at the bottom.
But that's where the problem is.
That's what we've been doing for the past 30 years is just, you know, the issue of inequality disappeared, but people, you know, progressives still sort of talked a little bit about poverty at the bottom. The broader problem is the inequality, and as long as you only focus on the bottom, you don't draw in the rest of the population.
I agree.
In fact, the statistics show that over time, the periods when the rich are the richest, when you would think they would be most generous in terms of, helping out the poor a bit, are the times that inequality becomes the greatest.
Because what, they indulge in all sorts
Because
of
they're-
orgiastic spending on themselves?
Well, and because they become so powerful. See, what we haven't even talked about very much yet is one of the big problems with having so much concentrated economic power at the top is not just that it's unfair in terms of distribution of income, but that it concentrates so much power, political power at the top. And that when you have that political power concentrated at the top, then those people use their power to do all kinds of things. For instance, to deregulate financial markets so that they can speculate. But also they use their power to block things like progress on climate change.
Well, let me ask Robin about this, because this country has taken some steps in the last 10 years or so to pass laws that make it illegal to essentially buy elections. You have very strict limits on how much money you can give. Does that speak to her point adequately enough in your view?
Not really, Steve. I mean, I don't think that limiting how much individuals can give to parties or campaigns addresses the deeper systemic question that Linda's pointing out, which is that when you have, let's say, 10,000 Canadians who have a disproportionate share of national wealth, it's not that they've given $1,500 or $1,100 to the Prime Minister's party that gets their phone answered or gets their request responded
Just
to.
being who they are.
It's who they are. And I think, Bob, in response to your point, if I may, from a political perspective, the challenge of saying it's about the poor and it's about the rich as opposed to the people in the middle is that not only does it break down any sense of solidarity politically, as Linda says, I think it also misunderstands what's happening. One statistic that I found absolutely mind-boggling, in Spain, 50% of people under 25 are unemployed. I mean, that is an unbelievable number in a developed democracy. And so that obviously captures kids who've been to university, who are children of the middle class, who didn't think that would be their fate. That's a different phenomenon than we faced.
And it's
But that's not
obviously-
happening here. I mean,
it's not as bad here for
No.
sure, but you see the same kind of problems with the middle class in the sense that in addition to no wage growth in the past 30 years, which is very serious, cutbacks in things like the ability to afford university because university is much more expensive than it used to be, tremendous economic insecurity. In addition to the lower wages, people don't have the security of full-time jobs and predictable employment they had before.
Let me pick up on something you said and go to John Kay with this, because you talked about, do we need to change the tax system in order to address some of this? And let me see if I can pull a question out of that. Do you think the top 1% in this society need to pay more to show their appreciation for the fact that this society has enabled them to be, in some respects, part of the top 1%?
I think that case is made well in Linda's book, The Trouble with Billionaires. I think we are closer to getting it right here in Canada than in the United States. What troubles me in the US debate is the answer to every question is lower taxes. And I think a turning point came a couple of months ago when Warren Buffett wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying, something is wrong with the system where I'm paying a lower tax rate than my secretary. I don't think Canada has reached that point yet where you have so many tax loopholes and such a skewed tax system where rich people are getting away with murder like they are in the United States. But I certainly think it's true since the Reagan era in the United States, conservatives on both sides of the border have overstated the worth of trickle-down economics. I think you can increase tax rates on the wealthiest people and still have a healthy capitalist system.
Okay, but from, is it 9 or 10? 9 or 10 Republican presidential candidates to Stephen Harper and Jim Flaherty to Dalton McGuinty and Dwight Duncan. No one wants to raise taxes these days. So where does that leave you?
Well, because that's been the mantra for the past 30 years. You know, that's why, and the argument has been, oh, you can't raise taxes at the higher levels, or, you know, you'll discourage economic growth. There's been all these arguments that, in fact, when you break them down, are not actually true. There's no evidence if you look back in the early post-war period in both Canada and the United States, we had much higher taxes on the rich, and we had much higher levels of growth. So that argument that they use all the time is just simply not true.
And yet
but it's been accepted as dogma.
It's political truism today.
Absolutely.
But
But that's what we have to change.
You know, I think we're also seeing a bit of a change here. John, as a thoughtful Canadian conservative writer, David Frum, David Brooks, a number of thoughtful American conservative writers have in the last year said, equality matters to conservatives too, because if you do allow an underclass to develop over time, it produces chaos. It will produce rebellion. It will lead to people doing more than taxing the rich. And so I think we're beginning to see some smarter conservatives thinking, okay, we have to figure out a way of addressing the issue of inequality without sounding like tax and spend liberals. But even that part of the dialogue, to me, is quite new and quite interesting.
And Bob, are you prepared to give the Occupy movement some credit for getting that notion on the public agenda?
Yes, I will say that. It has put it on the agenda.
But that's a huge accomplishment.
It is.
Huge.
It is. But and I want to keep going on with what you're saying about inequality, and mention that, you know, we know that in societies where inequality is high, and not just if poverty is high, but inequality is high, they tend to be less tolerant. There's all kinds of
Productivity
research
goes down?
on that. Sorry?
Productivity falls?
Productivity
Poor
falls.
health
You can look to
results.
Scandinavia to see that. You can your tolerance is less. Social trust is lower. People don't trust each other. Crime rates go up. So inequality has these kinds of effects, even if the society is rich.
Can I just jump in on one point about whether these issues have been raised by the Occupy movement? Because I guess this is a vote in favor of the Occupy movement. As an experiment, I went to a media database and I looked at the number of references to the term income inequality in the last roughly 10 weeks since the Occupy movement took hold in mid-September. And I got about 820 hits in the whole Canadian media for 820 hit for income inequality. I then looked at the previous 10-week period, and I got 200 hits. So during the Occupy movement, you had a quadrupling of references to income inequality. Now, I still think income inequality, as much as I think it's important, it's a wonkish subject, and it's hard for people to dig their teeth into. But to the extent you can get people interested in it from a strictly quantitative point of view, there has been some success in Canada.
How about from a qualitative point of view? Do you think Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario now have a better understanding and appreciation of that issue given Occupy?
I think it has to hit them in a personal way. The problem right now is, and this is a more complicated problem, but it goes to politics, is that people are simply more segregated in income stratified peer groups than they used to be. There was a Toronto survey that was done a couple of months ago by colleagues at University of Toronto that said, you know, in 1970, 70% of people lived in middle-income, mixed-income neighborhoods. Now that figure is 30%. And so people tend to hang out with members of their economic and social class more. So if you get a bunch of upper-middle-class conservatives in a room talking about tax rates, you know, they don't have trouble, you know, buying groceries. They don't have trouble with government services. You don't have a constituency there for helping people who are in a lower economic class. That's a big thing that was different from my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation. You just had more intermingling of people, and so people recognized the needs of poor people because they met them every day. That is a much bigger problem.
You're not sold.
Actually,
No,
you know,
I'm not sold on that at all, John. I'm sorry. I mean, I think the sense of social cohesion in Canadian society, while under pressure, has not ruptured. You will not find, for example, in a Rosedale cocktail party, which I am subject to from time to time, the kind of attitudes that you will find in Forest Hills in New York. The Canadian upper middle class retain a sense of commitment to the health of the community still. I grant you it's under pressure.
They may have that in their heart, but if you don't know that many people who are poor, you don't know the challenges they're facing, you have to read about it in books like Linda McQuaig's book. If it's not a personal experience for you, there is less of an emotional dynamo that's driving you to help these people. And that's just something that's different from 40 years ago. There's just less intermingling of rich and poor people.
Bob, you wanted to say?
I'm not sure that it's different from 40 years ago, though I agree with your point. There's not enough intermingling. In fact, I think that research will show that there's more today than there was 40 years ago. Working class neighborhoods, people used to stay in their community. Now they're reaching out, they travel. They didn't have the money to do that in the past. So there's actually more of that now. But having said that, I still think middle class people or upper middle class people, as you say, they really have no idea how the working class lives. They have no idea. The average.
And if they did, they would favor different policies.
I would think so.
Surely the Americans in this and in many other cases politically are ahead of us. Remember Bill Clinton started off saying now, almost 20 years ago, it's not America when hardworking people who obey the rules and have always struggled very hard to do the right thing cannot produce a decent life for their children.
Yeah.
I mean, that was an early, more elegant formation of the idea that this isn't fair. There's something wrong here.
Yeah, and that upward mobility that was always a key part of the American dream
Not
is
anymore.
really gone.
But having
And
said
It was
that,
never there.
actually, Paul Martin made the exact same point about Canada the other day, talking about how he supported the Occupy movement because he said always in Canadian history and in American history, every generation has felt that they could do better, their children would do better than they did. Now we don't have that anymore.
I know you care about the message, but I wonder whether, and again, thinking of how, put yourself in the shoes of Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario, when they see people in cold weather, sleeping in tents, looking scruffy, banging drums, doing the one person speaks and then everybody repeats, does that help get the message across?
You know, I find this interesting because it's not as if they've been scruffy and violent and difficult.
Not
and
violent.
But scruffy a little bit, yes. Sleeping in tents is something that impresses me with their commitment. These are young people. They're not hanging around malls. They're not just zoning out on Facebook. They are actually engaged in important questions
They
about
are.
the future of our society. I think people, and in fact the polls show this, the polls show that the general public is really quite supportive.
But if part of the, and you tell, listen, I'm not in the media massaging business, you are, in the message massaging business. If you can't identify with the people protesting to deliver that message because they just don't seem like you, is that a problem?
Well, you put your finger on a very fascinating conundrum here, Steve, because I agree with you. And if I hadn't seen the poll data that Linda's referring to, I would think that absolutely you're right. But for some reason, somehow, most middle-class observers looked beyond the scruffiness, the drum pounding, the peculiarities, and said, I like what they're saying. Yeah. 2/3 of Americans, weeks before the shutdown, were in sympathy with the aims of the Occupy movement. That's quite extraordinary.
And you also have labor being supportive, which isn't traditionally the case. That we didn't find labor supportive during the Vietnam protests and things like that. So that's an interesting
Organized
element.
labor.
Organized
Unions
labor,
have been out.
yeah.
But what about this, John? You've had Kanye West and Michael Moore out there. Now these are guys who are quite sympathetic philosophically to the message, but they're not part of the 1%. They're part of the 1/100%. These are rich guys.
Yeah, you know what?
Is that an issue?
I don't buy the idea that just because someone's rich doesn't mean they can't protest on behalf of poor people. Like Warren Buffett, one of the richest guys in the world, he wrote one of the most influential op-eds in the New York Times about income inequality. However, I do think the argument needs to be reframed a little bit for conservatives. If you're talking about income inequality, the big argument on the left is social justice. Most of the people I work with, most of the letter writers in the National Post, they don't care about social justice. And to the extent they care, they say we take pretty good care of the poor in Canada, especially compared to the United States. The point you have to make if you're fighting income inequality is this. This is about the basic functioning of capitalism. If you have a society where middle-class people can't buy the basic building blocks of a middle-class life, capitalism breaks down. So if you're a conservative, you're on the right, you believe in capitalism, you want it to work. This is what FDR basically said.
And
He
why
said,
Conrad Black loved him so much. He saved it.
you have to create the conditions for it. And that's the message I would do. My message would not be social justice, because the people who believe in social justice, they're already on your side. You have to say, if you like capitalism, this is the way to make it work, because if all the money's going to the super rich, there's only so many toasters they can buy.
Well, tell me that, Robin, if you were in a position to give advice to these guys, I mean, the big question now is, what next? You've managed to get an agenda out there on the political landscape to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Now what do you do?
You know, I always remember a quote of my friend Shirley Douglas, Tommy Douglas's daughter, who was heavily involved in the U.S. anti-war movement. And she said, we woke up one morning and it had disappeared. The war was over and the movement collapsed with it. And I think that's a real risk for the Americans. It's less of a risk in Western Europe, in Canada, and in South America, where there are some supporting institutions on the left to keep their messaging alive. But I think John's right. I think there's a really delightful opportunity for a smart politician now to do a synthesis of the left and right critique and say, You can be in favor of this because you believe in social justice. You can be in favor of this because you think society will collapse if we continue down this path. But for whatever reason, we got to do something different. And we've got to produce a state that performs better, a tax system that is fairer, and an ability for people to work hard to have employment.
Red Tories are all dead in this country.
No, but I mean,
They're all gone.
But maybe this is a chance to revive them, because I like the argument John makes. You know, I mean that.
Who would have thought we'd see the day, Linda?
Agreeing on something.
And Henry Simons, who's one of the founders of the Chicago School, makes the exact same arguments in favor of a progressive income tax. He says you simply can't, if you leave the system on its own and you don't tax and redistribute, what you end up with is just huge accumulations of wealth at the top, and that doesn't work in a democracy. Because in a democracy, you got to spread the benefits, or else the middle class won't support it anymore.
If just one thing we haven't talked about, which I think is something completely unrelated but contributes to this, is peer marriage.
Is which?
Peer marriage. The idea of basically people who get married in law school or med school, you have, 50 years ago, you had more intermingling of rich and poor in marriages. Now, in my neighborhood or in other neighborhoods I've seen, you basically have, a doctor marrying a banker, or, an accountant married a lawyer, and you basically have wealth not just concentrating in neighborhoods, but within marriages. And this is something that wasn't so much a problem maybe 50 years ago, when people got married earlier and they had different fortunes in life. Now people are getting married later. They tend to marry within their own peer group. And I don't know how people buy homes in the city.
They don't.
If you have people, earning salaries as teachers, firemen, policemen, store clerks, and you look at the amount of money it costs to buy a house.
Well, that's why they live in the suburbs.
That's why but even in the suburbs, it's tough.
Yeah. Bob, what does this movement do now?
What does the movement do? Well, maybe they've got it. Well, first of all, they got to get a leader. They need some leaders, and they need a message. I think they need a message.
Jeez, look what they've done without a leader.
Well,
Yeah, it's only.
look what they've done without a leader. But you mentioned David Brooks earlier. Even Brooks says this, says they've come a long way without a leader. But come on, people, there are no movements in history ever that get to the finish line without a leader.
But their goal is
Even anarchists
Well,
need
no, but
leaders.
their goal is not that they are going to take over government themselves. Their goal is to change the way society looks at these
but how are
issues.
you gonna do that without somebody-
here? They cannot continue banging the drum in the park, A, because they're going to freeze to death this winter.
No, they've gone
But by
better.
next spring, it ain't going to be a news story, because the TV editors are going to say, we did the banging the drum 6 months ago. What do you got new
Robin,
for us?
I'm not disagreeing that they have to move on to different strategies, but I'm just saying anointing somebody as the leader, I don't think is the key.
about
to that.
electing?
Without a leader,
You don't have to anoint, you could elect, These things do happen.
and
Bob,
without
go
a
ahead.
leader, you can't get a message. I mean, you can't get a coherent message. And what kind of message do they got to give? Well, I'm agreeing with everything I'm hearing, really, and that is, there's too much inequality. We've got to fix it. But the only thing is taxation the only way? Probably not.
It's absolutely the key way.
Well, no, I'm not sure. That is one of the ways.
What's a better way?
I don't know if it's better, but we have to do something else, and that is more labor market coordination, for example. The Northern European countries, they business leaders, labor leaders, and government leaders get together and decide what does the economy
Trade
need.
education.
Yeah,
Can
what
I
do they
just
need? Do we need
quickly
trade
say
education?
on the tax front, because it's true, there's all kinds of different things you can do. Funding public education much more extensively, all these kinds of things, poverty eradication. But the tax system is the single most potent instrument if you want to deal with income inequality.
Linda,
You can
the
deal with
problem-
it quickly, sweepingly, and, as Henry Simons, the conservative, would say, without disturbing too much the way the
Robin,
economy
take the last
works.
30.
You need to demonstrate the outcomes that changes in taxation will deliver that make people comfortable about paying those taxes. And sadly, one of the consequences of the last 30 years is that the right has demolished the logic and legitimacy of government service on the one hand, and frankly, governments have failed to perform as well as they should have. So yes, higher taxes, but better outcomes better come from them, or it won't last long.
Obviously, that's our next show.
In which case, I thank all four of you for occupying this table today, and we'll get you back here another time and continue the discussion. Linda McQuaig, The Trouble with Billionaires, is her latest, and Kay, you must be getting a piece of the action because you mentioned that book twice on this program so far.
No comment.
Robin Sears from Navigator alongside her, Jonathan Kay from the National Post, Bob Anderson from the University of Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody, for taking part today.